They took her seat. They took her name. They took her memory of 11 men she carried out of a valley. They gave it to a woman who never once held a dying soldier's hand. I stood in a chapel doorway. It smelled like candle wax and old carpet. A nurse in teal scrubs put her palm flat against the door. "You don't belong here," she said. "Wait outside." She said it like you'd tell a stray dog off a porch. Behind her, 11 photographs hung in black frames. Every face was one I'd closed my eyes to remember for 15 years. I didn't argue. I never do. I looked at her hand on the door. I thought about the 22 seconds it takes a man to bleed out from a wound like that, if nobody moves fast. I thought about how fast I used to move. Then I said nothing at all. 3 hours earlier, I was pouring coffee at the Chillicothe VA. I was telling a scared kid his blood pressure was fine. His hands would stop shaking eventually. But before the coffee, there was an envelope, taped shut, inside my coat. I'd touched it every morning for 15 years and never once opened it. There was a promise, too, made to a captain. He bled out under a gray Kandahar sky while I held his hand and told him it would be all right. We both knew it wouldn't. Let me take you back. Back to the morning the fog sat low on Marietta Road. Back before anyone tried to take that morning away from me. My name is Diane Mercer. I'm 44. I live in a rented half-double on Mill Street in Chillicothe, Ohio. I work nights as a hospice aide. It's the only job I've found where nobody minds that I flinch at loud doors. I don't talk about the Army much. I don't talk about the 11 men from Iron Troop, 2nd Squadron. They went into a valley outside Kandahar in the spring of 2011. They came out in bags, all except me. I was their medic. 68 whiskey, they call it. Combat medic. I was the only one who came home breathing. For 15 years I've carried that like debt. Quiet. At 3 in the morning. Doing the math on what I owe and to whom. That April morning I put on my one good coat. Gray wool. The collar doesn't lay flat anymore. I drove 11 minutes to the chapel inside the VA for the annual memorial for my unit. I'd gone every year since 2012, sometimes alone, sometimes with Ruth Calloway. Her son Ellis died 2 feet from me in that valley, his hand in mine. Ruth wasn't there yet. I was early. I'm always early. I learned a long time ago, the ones who show up first get to leave last. Leaving last used to be my whole job. The chapel doors stood propped open, folding chairs in careful rows. A card table by the entrance held a coffee can wrapped in construction paper, a slot cut in the lid, a sign in looping cursive, Valley Angels Memorial Fund. And there she was, Heather Coyle, RN, her name tag said. Pink lanyard, a small gold pin shaped like wings. She had that clean, practiced warmth nurses learn to wear. On her it had gone too smooth, too rehearsed, a smile that spent more time in front of a mirror than in front of a person. She stood at the door greeting people, touching elbows, saying things like the boys would be so glad you came, like she had a claim on what the boys would have thought about anything. I walked toward the door. She put her hand flat against it. "You don't belong here," she said again, gentle this time. Gentle is worse than shouting. Shouting at least admits it's a fight. I looked at her hand, then past her, at the photographs, at Ellis Calloway's crooked grin, taken the week before he died, at Captain Daniel Royce's serious eyes, still giving orders from inside the frame. "I served with them," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I'm sure you did," she said, in a tone that meant the opposite. "This is a private ceremony, for families, for the caregivers who were actually there with these men in their final hours. I don't recognize you." There it was, actually there, like I'd been somewhere else that day, like I hadn't held Ellis Calloway's hand while it went cold in the dirt. My jaw tightened. Somewhere behind my ribs, an old voice said, "Don't. Not here. Not yet." I don't get loud. I get steady. That's not a slogan I picked up somewhere. That's just what's left of me after the desert took the rest. "I'll wait outside," I said. I stepped back onto the sidewalk. That's when I saw him. A young man, maybe 23, standing off to the side in an army windbreaker 2 sizes too big. His face going the color of wet paper. I know that color. I've seen it 100 times. It's the color a body goes right before gravity wins the argument. I moved before I decided to move. 2 fingers to his wrist, pulse thready and fast. A flat hand on his back, steering him into a folding chair. I started counting out loud. Low, steady. 1, 2, 3. Breathe out on 4. There you go. You're all right. You're not dying. You're just standing in the sun with an empty stomach. He blinked up at me. Confused, grateful, a little embarrassed. "How'd you know?" "I used to do this for a living," I said. He didn't ask what that meant. Most people don't. They see a plain gray coat, a slight limp nobody asks about, and they fill in the rest with whatever story fits. Fine by me. I've never needed to correct anybody's assumptions. I only ever needed 11 men in a valley to know I wouldn't let go of their hands. Every one of them already knew that. I never did. His name was Cody. Cody Ellis, he told me, once his color came back. And something in my chest went very still, because Ellis was a name I'd spent 15 years trying not to hear out loud. "Ellis?" I said. "Family name?" "My uncle," Cody said. "Died overseas before I was born. Never met him. My mom talks about him sometimes." I didn't say anything. I touched the envelope inside my coat, where it always sat, and thought, not yet, not here. I helped him to his feet instead. Inside, the chapel filled up. I watched Heather Coyle work the room like a politician works a fundraiser. A hand on a shoulder here, a low murmur of comfort there. Her head tilted just so. Practiced grief on a face that had never, as far as I could tell, actually grieved anyone in that room. I stood outside a long while. The fog burned off Marietta Road in slow gray strings. I thought about a man named Daniel Royce and a promise I made him with his blood on my hands. Some debts don't come due until the exact moment you've stopped expecting them to. Chillicothe matters here. It matters, the kind of town it is. Ross County, mostly farmland, cut by the Scioto River. A paper mill that used to run 3 shifts now runs 1. A main street with more empty storefronts than full ones. Plywood in half the windows. A VA hospital that's the biggest employer for 30 miles in any direction. The reason half this quiet town keeps a story like mine tucked away in a drawer. I moved here after my discharge. It was cheap. Nobody knew who I used to be. There's a mercy in being a stranger in a small town. Nobody expects anything from you at all. I work overnight at a hospice house on the east side, off Western Avenue. Low brick building, a garden nobody tends anymore. A nurse's station that smells like burnt coffee no matter the hour. I hold hands there too, mostly. Different kind of dying. Same kind of holding. I don't get loud, I get steady. I said that twice that morning outside the chapel. Once when Heather Coyle put her hand on the door. Once when I watched her point a grieving mother toward the back row, like she was doing her a favor. The mother's name I'd learn later, Sharon Petrosky. Her son Miguel died 4 hours after Ellis, in the same valley, that same terrible afternoon. Sharon had come to this memorial for years, too. Every year, it seemed, she got seated a little farther back, closer to the door, while Heather Coyle stood at the podium up front, like she was the one who'd actually been there. Something was wrong in that room. I could feel the shape of it, the way you feel weather changing in an old injury, a pressure you can't name but can't ignore either. Around 10, Heather stepped up to a small podium near the photographs. She tapped a microphone that didn't need tapping. 15 years ago, she said, voice pitched for maximum tremble. 11 of Ross County's finest sons went into a valley in Afghanistan. They never came home. I had the privilege of being with some of them in their final hours. I held their hands. I told them they were loved. I made a promise I would never let their memory fade. That promise became the Valley Angels Memorial Fund. I stood in the doorway. Something cold moved through my chest. Slow, deliberate, like watching ice form on a window, one crystal at a time. I held their hands. I was the one who held their hands. I was the only medic in that column. I was the only person from Iron Troop who came home breathing. And I have never, in 15 years, told a soul in this town I was there. Grief is not a stage. I never wanted an audience for mine. But she wanted one. She'd built one, brick by brick, donation by donation. She was standing on it now like it was a foundation she'd poured herself. I touched the envelope again. 11 letters inside. Their own words, folded soft from 15 years of handling. Given to me by a dying captain who trusted me with the last thing those men would ever say to the people who loved them. I hadn't delivered a single one. That's the debt. The one I still owed, walking into that chapel. Heather Coyle stood at that podium telling a room full of grieving mothers she'd held 11 hands she'd never touched. She was about to become the reason I finally paid it. Ruth Calloway found me outside a few minutes later, her cane tapped careful and slow on the concrete. Her eyes were red before the ceremony had even started. She still won't let me sit up front, Ruth said. No hello first. 15 years of grief does that. Cut straight past the pleasantries. 15 years, Diane. I buried my only son, and I sit in the back so that woman can cry on cue for people who write checks. I know, I said. Do you? Ruth looked at me hard, the way she sometimes did, like she suspected there was more in me than I ever let show. You've been standing outside that door every year, like it's not your memorial, too. I didn't answer that. Some questions you let sit in the air. Answering costs more than you have that day. Come sit with me, Ruth said. Even in the back. Especially in the back. That's where the ones who are actually there always end up. Have you noticed that? I had noticed. Every year. Never said a word about it, because saying something meant standing up. Standing up meant being seen. Being seen meant answering questions I'd spent 15 years arranging my whole quiet life to avoid. But something had shifted in me that morning. A hairline crack, forming slow under pressure for a decade and a half. It gave a little more with every word Heather Coyle said into that microphone. I don't get loud. I get steady. I walked back inside, past the hand that told me I didn't belong. I sat next to Ruth Calloway, second to last row. I watched Heather Coyle work a room full of dead men's mothers like a woman selling insurance. I put my hand flat against the envelope in my coat. All right, Daniel, I thought. All right. I hear you. Make it mean something, he'd said, close to his last words, whispered through blood and dust while I pressed both hands against a wound no pressure was ever going to fix. Make it mean something, Mercer. Don't let it just be dirt and paperwork. Make it mean something. 15 years, and I'd failed to figure out what that meant. Sitting in that folding chair, watching a woman who'd never once smelled cordite claim she'd held 11 hands she'd never touched, I finally understood. It didn't mean revenge. Daniel Royce wasn't built for revenge. He was built for order, for accuracy, for the plain truth laid out where everyone could see it. It meant standing up eventually, setting the record straight, quietly, the way I did everything. No raised voice, no need for applause, just the truth, delivered flat and factual, like a vital sign. Impossible to argue with. Not yet, though. Not that morning. That morning, I only sat and listened and let the cold in my chest turn, slowly, into something with a shape and a direction. The ceremony ran another 40 minutes. Heather read a poem she said she'd written herself, though the cadence felt store-bought, the kind you'd find in a greeting card aisle. She passed the coffee can for donations, thanked everyone for supporting her boys, closed with a moment of silence, stretched a beat too long, the way people do when they want you to notice how deeply they're feeling something. I watched Sharon Petrosky wipe her eyes in the back row. I thought about Miguel, whose hand I'd also held, whose last words also sat in that envelope. Grief can be stolen the same way a wallet gets stolen, quietly, while the person it belongs to looks the other way. After, I stood near my car and watched Heather walk two donors toward a small brick outbuilding behind the chapel. A hand-lettered sign read, Valley Angel's Office. She unlocked it with a key from her lanyard. Before the door swung shut, I caught a glimpse inside. A metal filing cabinet, a laptop, a corkboard covered in donation receipts. She glanced back over her shoulder just before the door closed. For half a second, our eyes met across the lot. I recognized something in her face. Not recognition of me. Fear. The particular cornered fear of someone who built something on sand and just watched the tide come in closer than expected. I got in my car, sat there a long minute before I turned the key. I don't get loud. I get steady. But steady, I was learning that morning, doesn't mean still forever. Sometimes steady just means the wait before the exact right moment to move. I didn't go straight home. I drove past the hospice house first. Slow, the way I do sometimes. I need to look at a building that's never once lied to me about what it is. Then I drove to the library on Paint Street, sat down at one of the public computers, the ones with sticky keys and a 15-minute timer. I typed in Valley Angels Memorial Fund, Chillicothe, Ohio. It took 4 searches to find it, buried under a wedding photographer with a similar name. But there it was, a registered nonprofit, filed with the Ohio Attorney General's Charitable Law Section in 2013. Heather Marie Coyle listed as founder, president, and treasurer, all 3 titles. One woman. I sat there a long time, the way you look at an X-ray that shows something you were hoping wasn't there. A nonprofit with one person holding every seat on the board isn't automatically a crime. I know that much. I've read enough paperwork in my own small life to know the difference between sloppy and criminal. But it's the kind of structure that makes it very easy to move money nobody else is watching. I printed the registration page, a dime a sheet, folded it into my coat, next to the envelope I still hadn't opened. That night at the hospice house, I sat with a man named Walter Pruitt, 81, dying slow and patient, a heart that had simply run its course. Around 2 in the morning, I was checking his oxygen, fixing his pillow. He asked why I looked like I was carrying something heavier than usual. I don't talk about myself much with patients. It isn't professional. It isn't kind either, making a dying man's last weeks about my own weather. But Walter had a way of asking questions that made silence feel rude. "There's a woman in town," I said, "telling people she did something I did, doing it for money." Walter was quiet a moment, his breathing thin and careful. "You gonna say something?" "I don't know yet." "You will," he said, like it was already decided somewhere I couldn't see. People who carry things as quiet as you do, they don't stay quiet forever. They just wait for the right room. I thought about that for days. The next week, I found Sharon Petrosky at the Kroger on Bridge Street, buying groceries alone. The way she always seemed to be doing everything alone since Miguel died. She didn't recognize me at first. I almost let her walk past. Something in me, some part done being quiet, made me say her name. Sharon. I'm Diane. I was there with your son, in the valley. She stopped so fast her cart nearly tipped. Her eyes went wide and wet. You were there, she said. Not a question. Relief. The specific relief of someone who's spent 15 years hearing a stranger's story, finally meeting someone who was actually in the room. I held his hand, I said. Both of them, near the end. He wasn't scared. He kept asking about his little sister's softball game, wanted to know if she'd made varsity. Sharon's hand went to her mouth. She did. That spring. Nobody ever told me he asked about that. He asked twice, I said. I remember, because it was the last coherent thing he said. We stood in the cereal aisle of a grocery store in Ross County and cried together. First time in 15 years. First time I'd told anyone the truth about that valley out loud. Heather says she was there, Sharon said finally, wiping her face. Says she held his hand. Tells that story at every memorial. She wasn't there, I said, flatter than I meant it. I was the only medic. I was the only one there. Sharon's face did something complicated. Grief, confusion, a slow, terrible understanding, all at once. Then who's been telling us all these years our boys weren't alone? Has she been lying? I don't know everything yet, I said, but I intend to find out. Then Sharon told me something that stopped my breath cold. She told us there weren't any letters, Sharon said. Years ago, when the fund started, said there wasn't time, that the men died too fast for last words, said we should take comfort, knowing it was quick. I stood very still in that cereal aisle. I had 11 letters right then, in a taped envelope in my coat, written in the shaking hands of 11 dying men. Some took 4 minutes to write. Some took 40. I'd promised a captain I would deliver them. 15 years had passed, and I hadn't delivered one. She hadn't just stolen the memory of holding their hands. She'd erased the fact they'd had time to say goodbye at all. Buried it so deep, grieving mothers believed their sons died without a single word for them. The truth sat folded in my coat the whole time. Sharon, I said, quiet now, careful. I need you to trust me on something. I'm going to need some time. But I promise you, there were words. There were always words. She looked at me like I'd handed her a rope in deep water. What do you mean? I can't say more right now, I said. But I will. Soon. I need to do this the right way. I left the Kroger without finishing my shopping, sat in my car 20 minutes, both hands on the wheel, not driving anywhere, just breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, the way I used to breathe before a mission, until the shake in my hands settled into something I could work with. Next morning, I went to the county recorder's office, requested Valley Angels Memorial Fund's public filings. The Form 990's nonprofits have to file. A clerk named Patricia Sowers pulled them up in about 10 minutes and printed copies for a small fee. I sat on a bench outside the office and read through 5 years of filings. What I found turned the cold in my chest from ice into something closer to fire. Over 5 years, the fund had taken in a little over $211,000 in donations. According to its own filings, it had given exactly $4,300 directly to the 11 families it claimed to serve. Spread over 5 years, about $78 per family per year. The rest, the filings said, went to administrative costs, outreach, program development. Vague categories that, in my limited experience, usually mean somebody's salary, somebody's rent, somebody's car payment. I did the math twice. I wanted to be wrong. I wasn't. $206,700. Unaccounted for. 5 years. One signature on every account. I thought about Ruth's cane tapping careful on the concrete outside the chapel, about her sitting in the back row of her own son's memorial, year after year, while this woman cried on cue at a podium built from other people's grief. I thought about Sharon believing, 15 years, that her son died too fast for any last words. I don't get loud. I get steady. But steady people can still be exact. That afternoon, for the first time in 15 years, I took the taped envelope out of my coat, set it on my kitchen table, didn't open it yet, wasn't ready, but I looked at it a long while, the tape gone yellow and brittle at the corners, Daniel Royce's handwriting on the front, my name and rank, written in a hand steady even when everything else in that valley wasn't. Make it mean something, Mercer. I thought I finally understood, all the way through, for the first time. It didn't mean confronting Heather Coyle in a parking lot. It didn't mean shouting her down at next year's memorial. It meant doing this the way I'd been trained, methodically, quietly, facts assembled before you ever raise your hand to move. I called Colonel Marcus Webb that night. Hadn't spoken to him in almost 6 years. Not since he tracked me down through the VA to check on me. A kindness I never forgot. Though I'd let the relationship go quiet. The way I let most things go quiet. He answered on the third ring, voice exactly as I remembered. Calm, careful, built for delivering hard news without flinching. "Sergeant Mercer," he said. Something in me eased, hearing the old rank. Being called by a name that still meant something to at least one other living person. It's been a long time. "Colonel," I said, "I'm sorry to call so late. I need to talk to you. About Iron Troop, about the memorial fund back home." A pause on the line. The kind a career officer gives you when he can already tell it matters. "Tell me everything," he said. So I did. Heather Coyle, the podium, $206,000. Sharon Petrowski's face in the cereal aisle. The envelope on my kitchen table I still hadn't opened. When I finished, a long silence, long enough I checked the call hadn't dropped. "Diane," he said finally. First name, first time ever. "Do you know what's in that envelope? Beyond the letters?" "Just the letters," I said. "That's what Daniel told me. 11 letters home." Another pause. "I need you to sit down." I was already sitting. Something in his tone made me grip the table edge anyway. When Daniel Royce wrote the after-action report on that valley, Webb said, he included a separate recommendation, a Medal of Honor recommendation. For you. The room went very quiet. Quiet the way it goes right before you realize a sound you'd been hearing for years was actually silence the whole time. "That's not possible," I said. "I never heard anything. There was no ceremony, no call. The paperwork got lost," Webb said, heavy with something close to guilt. "Or shelved, deliberately or not, I never found out which. Somewhere between your discharge and the years you dropped off everyone's radar. I pushed it 2 years after Daniel died, never stopped believing it should go through. Then I lost track of you. Assumed, wrongly, someone else had picked it up." I sat at my kitchen table, envelope in front of me, and felt 15 years of assumptions rearrange themselves in real time. "Colonel," I whispered, "are you telling me there's a Medal of Honor citation somewhere with my name on it?" "I'm telling you Daniel Royce believed, with everything he had, that you earned one. He wrote the case himself, in his own hand before he died. Whether it ever got fully processed, I don't know. But I know exactly where his recommendation went. He gave me a copy. I still have it." I looked down at the envelope, at Daniel's handwriting, at 15 years built on assumptions I now understood, all at once, might be wrong. The envelope in front of me might not be 11 letters, it might be 12. I didn't sleep that night. Sat at my kitchen table until the sun came up. The envelope in front of me, both hands flat on either side of it, like I was bracing a wound. I called in sick to the hospice house the next morning. First sick day in 4 years. Sat with the envelope until nearly noon before I worked up the nerve to slide my thumb under the yellowed tape. Inside were 11 smaller envelopes, each one labeled in Daniel Royce's careful block handwriting with a name: Ellis Calloway, Miguel Petrosky, 9 others. Names I'd carried in my chest 15 years and never once said out loud in this town. Beneath all 11, at the bottom, a single folded sheet of official letterhead, creased soft from handling, ink faded but legible. I recognized the header before I even unfolded it. Department of the Army. Recommendation for award. My name, my rank, my unit, typewritten, followed by 4 paragraphs in Daniel Royce's own hand. Plain, unglamorous, describing what I'd done in that valley on the worst afternoon of my life. He wrote it the way he wrote everything: factual, precise, not a wasted word. Somehow that plainness hit harder than any flowery language could have. He described how I moved between wounded men, under fire, for over 3 hours. How I kept 8 men alive who, by every medical expectation, should have died in that field. How I kept treating the wounded even after shrapnel hit my own leg. The injury behind the limp nobody in Chillicothe ever asked about. At the bottom, in a hand that had clearly grown weaker, close to the end, he'd added one more line. Sergeant Diane Mercer represents the finest of what this uniform is meant to protect. If I do not survive to see this recommendation through, I ask that it not be forgotten. She will never ask for it herself. That is exactly why she has earned it. I sat in my kitchen and cried, first time in longer than I could remember. Not the careful, contained tears I sometimes let myself have at a patient's bedside. The kind that come up from somewhere old and buried. The kind that shake your whole body, leave you emptied out after. Lighter somehow, like something had finally been let go. When I could breathe steady again, I called Colonel Webb back. "I have it," I said. "I have his recommendation. It's here. It's real." "I know it's real," Webb said. "I've had my copy in a filing cabinet 15 years, Diane. I never stopped believing it should go through. I just never found you again to tell you." "What happens now?" "Now?" Webb said. "I make some calls. There's a process for this. Even 15 years late. Not fast, not guaranteed, but it exists. And I intend to push it exactly as hard as I should have pushed it 15 years ago." I sat a long moment, phone at my ear. "Colonel, there's something else, not about me." I told him about the fund, Heather Coyle, $206,000. A nurse who'd spent years telling grieving mothers a story that belonged to me, claiming a comfort she'd never once given. Webb went quiet. "You want me to expose her?" "I want the truth told," I said. "That's different. I don't want revenge. I want Sharon Petrosky to know her son had time to say goodbye. I want Ruth Calloway out of the back row of her own son's memorial. I want the money meant for those families to actually reach them." "And Heather Coyle?" I thought a long moment before I answered. "I want her exactly as visible as she's made herself. That's all. I want the truth as loud as her lies have been." "There's a memorial next year," Webb said slowly. "15th anniversary of the Valley. If I understand you right, that fund holds a bigger fundraising gala around the same time. Doesn't it?" "The Ross County Elks Lodge," I said. "I've seen the flyers. Valley Angels Gala. Every June. Bigger crowd. Local news usually covers it." "Then that's your room," Webb said. "If we're going to do this right, quiet and factual, the way Daniel would have wanted, That's where the truth does the most good for the most people. Give me time to work the process. Confirm the recommendation is moving. When it's ready, I'll be there myself. Over the following weeks, my life took a strange double shape. By day, I delivered letters. I started with Ruth Calloway, drove to her small house on the edge of town, sat with her at her kitchen table, handed her Ellis's letter, still sealed, exactly as her son had left it. I should have brought this to you 15 years ago, I said. I'm sorry it took this long. Ruth's hands shook taking it. She didn't open it right away, just held it against her chest a long moment, eyes closed. When she finally looked at me, something in her face looked almost like relief, mixed with a grief so old it had gone smooth, like a stone worn soft by years of water. You carried this the whole time, she said. Not a question. I didn't know how to give it to you, I said. Kept telling myself I was waiting for the right moment. I think I was just scared how much it would hurt both of us. It hurts either way, Ruth said. But this way, it means something. She opened it with careful hands. Read it slow, lips moving slightly over some of the words. When she finished, she pressed it flat against the table and smoothed it once, gently, the way you'd smooth a child's hair. He talks about his sister, Ruth said, voice thick. Says to tell her he was proud of her before he even knew if she'd make the team. Believed in her before he had any proof. He believed in a lot of things, I said. He was like that. I delivered Sharon's letter the following week. Same kitchen table ritual. Coffee poured with trembling hands. Miguel had asked about his sister's softball game, just like I remembered. The letter said so, in his own careless, funny 17 going on 18 handwriting, along with a request that made Sharon laugh and cry at once. Never let his little sister quit softball, no matter how bad a season got. She's coaching now, Sharon said, wiping her eyes. Middle school softball, 6 years. Then he got exactly what he asked for, I said. One by one, over 6 weeks, I found the families of the other 9 men. Some still in Ross County, a few in Columbus, Cincinnati, one all the way in Tennessee. Each delivery took something out of me and gave something back. Grief and relief tangled so tight, I stopped trying to separate them. By night, I did something else. I built a file. I went back to the recorder's office twice more, requested every public filing Valley Angels had ever submitted. Cross-referenced donation amounts from old newspaper coverage against the fund's reported income. Found a Facebook group for local supporters. Read through years of posts. Watched Heather post photo after photo of herself at fundraisers. Always front and center. Always positioned just so beside the memorial photographs. Always captioned the woman who was there. I found something else too. Something that turned my stomach cold in a way the money never had. A comment thread from 2 years back, under a photo of the 11 men. A woman I didn't recognize had asked, gently, whether the families ever received personal letters from their son's final hours. Heather's reply, still public. There simply wasn't time for letters, sweetheart. These men gave everything in an instant. That's the tragedy and the honor of it. Let's not romanticize something that painful. I sat with that a long time. She hadn't just failed to deliver a truth she didn't know. She'd actively, publicly, in writing, denied the truth existed. To protect a story that made her the emotional center of 11 deaths she'd had no part in. Ruth, meanwhile, had quietly become something like a partner in the whole effort. Once she understood what I was building and why, she started keeping her own records. Old programs from past galas, newsletters the fund had mailed out, receipts from small donations she'd made herself over the years, ones that never seemed to match anything the families actually received. I've had a bad feeling about that woman 6 years, Ruth told me one evening. spreading a folder across her kitchen table. Just didn't have anything to hang the feeling on. You're giving me something to hang it on. We need to be careful, I said. This isn't about ruining her out of spite. It's about the truth being told in the open, where it helps the families who were owed it. If we do this wrong, it becomes about her. It needs to stay about them. Ruth nodded slowly, folding her hands over the paperwork like a prayer. Daniel Royce. That was Ellis's captain, wasn't it? The one who wrote the letters? Yes. He sounds like he was a good man. He was the best man I ever knew, I said. Meant it more completely than I'd let myself feel in a long time. 6 weeks into my quiet campaign, Colonel Webb called with news that changed the shape of everything. The recommendation is moving, he said. It's been reviewed. There's a process left, verification, board review. But Diane, I need you to understand. 15 years late, through channels nobody expected still open, your Medal of Honor recommendation is finally active. I sat down hard, phone pressed so tight against my ear it hurt. There's more, Webb said. I want to be there in person when this becomes official. I want to read Daniel's own words aloud, in a room, in front of people who need to hear them. And Diane, I think you already know the room I mean. The gala, I said. The gala, Webb confirmed. June, 15th anniversary. If the timing holds, and I intend to make sure it does, I will personally deliver that citation. Read it aloud, in front of everyone who spent years believing a lie about what happened in that valley. I closed my eyes, thought about Heather Coyle at a podium, telling grieving mothers she'd held 11 hands she'd never touched, telling the world she'd held mine too, without ever knowing my name. I'll be there, I said, quietly, in the back, where I always sit. Not this time, Webb said. Something in his voice made it clear the discussion was already over. This time, Sergeant Mercer, you sit up front. The deliveries took me further than Ross County. I didn't know that yet in those first few weeks, when I still believed the hardest part was finding courage to knock on Ruth's door. There was a family in Portsmouth, an hour south along the river, the Hendersons. Their son Trevor was the youngest of the 11, barely 19 when he died. The kind of young that still shows in a soldier's letters no matter how much combat ages the rest of him. I drove down on a gray Saturday, the Ohio River low and slow beside the highway. Found Trevor's mother, Donna Henderson, working the counter of a small diner she'd run alone since her husband passed a decade back. She recognized my name before I finished introducing myself. Word travels far, even down the river. You're the medic, she said, wiping her hands on her apron, her voice carefully flat. The way people get when they've braced for grief so long they don't trust themselves to stop. Sit down. I'll get you coffee. Then you tell me everything. I told her the small, true things that mattered more than any grand account could. Trevor kept a photograph of the diner tucked in his helmet. He talked about coming home, finally learning to flip pancakes properly instead of leaving it to his mother. In his last minutes, he asked whether the Reds had won their game that week. They lost, Donna said, laughing and crying at once. Lost that whole season. He'd have been furious. He was, I said, for about 30 seconds. Then he laughed about it instead. Said some things aren't worth dying mad about. I handed her Trevor's letter. She held it a long moment without opening it, the way Ruth had, the way Sharon had. The reverence people save for the last physical trace of a voice they've spent years afraid of forgetting. Why now? She asked. Not unkind, just honest. Why 15 years? And why all of a sudden this year? Because a woman built a career telling your grief back to you wrong, I said, and I let her, longer than I should have. Delivering this letter meant admitting how long I'd failed to. I'm not proud of the 15 years. I'm only glad it isn't 16. Donna reached across the counter, took my hand, grip surprisingly strong for a woman who looked, in that moment, entirely undone. You're here now, she said. That's what matters. Trevor always said the ones who show up late still show up. He forgave people easier than anybody I ever knew. I carried that sentence with me the rest of that autumn, through every kitchen table that followed, through the growing file I was building against Heather Coyle, through the nights I lay awake, doing the math on whether the truth could move fast enough before the gala came. There was another family, the Okonkwo's, outside Cincinnati. Their son David had been the unit's quiet one, wrote longer letters than anyone else. 3 full pages, when most men managed a paragraph or two in their final clear minutes. His father, Emmanuel Okonkwo, a soft-spoken engineer, read the letter standing at his own kitchen counter, silent nearly 10 minutes, his wife's hand on his back the whole time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were dry, but his voice had gone rough. It told me exactly what the dryness was costing him. He wrote about faith, Emmanuel said, about believing there was a reason, even for the worst afternoon of his life. I always wondered if he had time to think past the fear at the end. Thank you for telling me he did. He did, I said, more than most. Asked me twice if I believed there was a reason. I told him I didn't know. He said that was fine. Said sometimes belief just means deciding to carry the question instead of needing the answer. Emmanuel nodded slowly, folding the letter with careful hands. That does sound like him. Each family gave me something back for what I delivered. Some fragment of the men I'd only known in their worst, final hours, filled back in now with softball games, pancake mornings, long letters about faith. The 11 names I'd carried as pure weight for 15 years slowly became 11 whole people again. Remembered, not just mourned. It was somewhere in that long autumn, sitting with the 9th family, a quiet couple in Chillicothe, whose son Anthony died second in that terrible sequence. That's when I finally understood Daniel Royce's instruction, the one that had eluded me 15 years running. Make it mean something never meant one grand gesture, one dramatic reveal in a crowded hall. It meant this, exactly this. 11 mornings of sitting across from grieving families, giving them back a truth they'd been denied, one kitchen table at a time, long before any gala, long before any medal, long before Heather Coyle's story ever came apart in public. The gala, when it finally came, would only be the moment the rest of the world caught up to work I'd already, quietly, finished. I hadn't planned on Heather Coyle noticing me before June. That was my mistake. A woman who'd spent 5 years building a story around herself was always going to notice when the truth started quietly rearranging things around her. It was Cody Ellis who tipped her off, not on purpose. He'd started stopping by the VA cafeteria some mornings, just to talk. The way young vets sometimes attach to whoever first treats them like a person and not a diagnosis. He mentioned in passing that his Aunt Sharon got some kind of letter from his Uncle Miguel, out of nowhere, after 15 years. Said it had something to do with a lady named Diane, who used to be a medic. He meant no harm. Just talking, the way young people talk, without weighing every word for what it might cost someone else. But word in a town the size of Chillicothe travels the way water travels, downhill, into every low place it can find. Within 2 weeks, I noticed small things had shifted. Heather stopped saying my name when our paths crossed at the VA. It happened sometimes, since she picked up shifts there when the hospital ran short-staffed. She used to nod, cool but polite. Now she looked through me entirely. the specific blankness of someone who's decided you're a problem she isn't ready to solve yet. Then, a Tuesday in May, she cornered me in the hospital parking lot. "I hear you've been telling people you were in Afghanistan," she said. No greeting, arms crossed over her scrubs, with the Iron Troop boys. "I was their medic," I said. "That's not a story. That's a fact you can verify with the VA in 10 minutes." Her jaw tightened. "I've dedicated years of my life to honoring those men. I don't know what you're trying to do, showing up now, telling the families things that upset them." "The truth upset them," I said, quiet even. Learning their sons had time to say goodbye, and that those goodbyes were kept from them 15 years. That upset them. "I'm sorry that's inconvenient for your gala." Her face ran through several expressions fast. Indignation, calculation, something that might have been fear if she'd let it surface all the way. "You have no idea what you're threatening to destroy," she said finally. "That fund helps people." "Then show me," I said. "Show me the distribution records. Show me where $206,000 went, if not to the families it claims to serve." Something drained out of her face, just for a second, before she rebuilt her composure, like pulling a curtain closed. "You don't know anything about running a nonprofit," she said. "Overhead is normal. Administrative costs are normal. You're a hospice aide playing detective, jealous I built something you never had the courage to build yourself." "I don't need to build anything," I said. "I already did the only thing that mattered. I kept 8 men alive in that valley. I carried the other three's last words home in my coat 15 years. You built a coffee can and a story." She didn't have an answer for that. Got in her car, drove off faster than the lot's speed bumps really allowed. I stood there a long moment after, hands steady, breathing even, feeling something that wasn't quite peace, but at least its neighbor. 2 weeks later, Ruth called, voice tight with an urgency I hadn't heard from her before. "She's changed the gala," Ruth said. "Saw it on the Facebook page. Moved it up. Not June anymore. 3 weeks." My stomach dropped. Why would she move it? "I think she's scared," Ruth said slowly. "I think she knows something's coming, and she's trying to get ahead of it before it lands. There's this too." Her voice dropped further. "The charity registration renewal with the state, the one that keeps her nonprofit legal. It's due for its 5-year audit review around the same time. I looked it up after you showed me those filings. If her paperwork isn't clean, the state can flag the whole organization for review." I sat with the phone at my ear, did the math the way I used to do triage math in the field. Fast, cold, prioritizing, 3 weeks. Colonel Webb had said the recommendation needed more time than that to finalize. Board review, formal notification. Bureaucracy moves at its own pace, no matter how urgent the truth feels to the people waiting on it. I called him that night. "She moved the gala up," I said. 3 weeks. "I think she's trying to cement her story publicly, get one more wave of donations before anyone catches up to what's actually in those filings." Webb went quiet a moment. I could hear him thinking. "The award process itself won't finish in 3 weeks," he said. "That's simply not how it works, even expedited. But Diane, I don't need the medal officially pinned to walk into that room and tell the truth. I have Daniel Royce's recommendation letter in his own hand. I have 30 years of rank behind my name. That's enough to make any room listen. Is it enough to stop her? It's enough that nobody in that room believes her story again," Webb said. "Whether it stops her financially, legally, that's a different fight. Slower one. But the truth doesn't need to move at the speed of an investigation to matter. It only needs to be heard." I thought about that a long time after we hung up. Ruth's warning stayed with me too, working itself into the part of my mind that still, after 15 years, ran risk assessments before sleep. I decided to do one more thing before the gala, something I hadn't planned on at all. I went to see Patricia Sowers again, not at the recorder's office this time. At her home, a modest ranch on the edge of town. Patricia, it turned out, sat on the board of the Ross County Community Foundation, an organization that reviewed local charities for grant eligibility. I need advice, I told her, sitting at her kitchen table with the same folder of filings I'd shown Ruth. Not accusations, just advice on the right way to raise a concern so it goes through proper channels instead of becoming a spectacle. Patricia read through the filings slow. Her expression grew more troubled each page. "This should have been flagged years ago," she said finally. "One signature authority. No independent board oversight. Administrative costs this disproportionate to direct distribution. This is exactly the pattern our foundation trains people to watch for. What do I do?" "File a formal concern with the Ohio Attorney General's Charitable Law Section," Patricia said. "It's not an accusation of a crime. Not yet. It's a request for review. They investigate independently. Takes the decision out of your hands. Puts it in the hands of people whose whole job is looking at exactly this kind of paperwork." I filed the concern that same week. Online, through the Attorney General's portal. Methodical. Factual. No accusations of malice. Just documented discrepancies between reported income and reported distributions. 5 years running. I didn't tell Heather Coyle. Didn't tell anyone except Colonel Webb, Ruth, and Patricia Sowers. Some things need to move quietly, through the proper doors, before they're ready to be spoken aloud in a room full of people. The days before the gala moved strange and slow, the way the last hours before a mission always used to move. Everything sharpened, every small sound significant. I picked up extra shifts at the hospice house. Staying busy was the only thing keeping the waiting from curdling into something worse. Walter Pruitt died on a Tuesday night. Quiet, his hand in mine. The way I'd held so many hands over so many years. In his last clear hour, he told me something I carried straight into that gala hall 3 days later. "You were right," he said, voice thin as paper, "about waiting for the right room. This is going to be it, isn't it?" "The room. I think so," I said. "Good," he said, and closed his eyes. I sat with him another 6 hours until his breathing finally, gently, stopped. I thought about how strange that was. A dying stranger in Ross County understood the shape of my 15-year debt better than I did, right up until the exact week it finally came due. The morning of the gala, I put on my one good dress. Dark navy, simple, the kind you wear to a funeral or a courtroom. Drove to the Ross County Elks Lodge. The original taped envelope sat on the passenger seat. Empty now, except for the recommendation letter, photocopied a dozen times. The original stayed with Colonel Webb for safekeeping. Ruth was waiting for me in the parking lot, dressed carefully, cane steady in her hand, eyes sharp with a resolve I hadn't seen in her in all the years I'd known her. "Sharon's inside already," Ruth said. "So are 3 other families. I called everyone I could reach this week, told them there'd be something worth hearing tonight." "Did you tell them what?" "No," Ruth said. "I told them the truth deserved an audience, and that Diane Mercer had finally decided to stop sitting in the back." I looked at the Elks Lodge, windows lit warm and gold against the early June evening, cars filling the lot. A banner over the entrance, "Valley Angels Memorial Gala, 15 Years of Honor." I felt the old, familiar cold settle into my chest one more time. The cold that carried me through that valley 15 years ago and never fully left since. I don't get loud. I get steady. "Let's go in," I said. The week before the gala moved slower than any week I could remember since my last deployment. Each day stretched thin and taut. The particular waiting soldiers know better than almost anyone. The waiting after the plan is set, before the mission begins, when there's nothing left to do but hold steady, trust the work already done. I used some of that waiting to finish something I'd started weeks earlier, kept setting it aside, out of a fear I didn't fully understand until I sat down to face it. I wrote my own letter, not to a family, to Daniel Royce. I know how that sounds, writing a letter to a dead man, but I'd carried his last instruction in my chest 15 years, like a splinter I refused to let a doctor remove. Felt finally like time to answer him properly, even if I was the only one who'd ever read it. I sat at my kitchen table one evening, legal pad, a pen that kept skipping. Wrote it slow, the way I do everything that matters. Captain, I wrote, it took me 15 years, but I think I finally understand what you meant. I thought making it mean something meant winning, proving something. I don't think that anymore. I think it meant telling the truth, even when it costs you the quiet life you built to hide from it. I think it meant giving 11 mothers and fathers back the goodbyes you trusted me to carry. I think it meant standing where you asked me to stand, in the open, the way I always did with you, not behind a door where nobody has to look at what happened. I folded that letter, put it in my coat, next to the photocopied recommendation. Somehow, writing it made the days easier to move through, like setting down one weight to properly lift another. Ruth called twice that week with updates from her own quiet reconnaissance. She'd developed a talent for this work, tracking Heather's public movements through the fund's social media, noting when posts grew more frequent, more desperate in tone. A shift from gratitude toward donors to something closer to pleading. She posted something strange this morning, Ruth told me, about renewed commitment and transparency moving forward. I think she knows something's coming, even if she doesn't know exactly what. She should know, I said. The state usually notifies an organization when a formal review opens. I imagine that letter's already sitting on her desk. Are you scared? Ruth asked, softer than I'd heard her in weeks. I thought about that honestly. I used to think fear and calm couldn't live in the same place at the same time. I don't think that's true anymore. I'm scared. I'm also as steady as I've ever been. I don't think those cancel out. I think they just both belong to me. Daniel would be proud of you, Ruth said. Never met him, but from everything you've told me, I believe that. He'd be proud of all of us, I said. You didn't have to keep coming back to that memorial every year sitting in the back. You could have stopped years ago. You didn't. Neither did you, Ruth said. Not much left to say after that. 3 days before the gala, Colonel Webb called with news that steadied something in me I hadn't realized was still shaking. The review board finalized their assessment this afternoon, he said. It's moving to final processing. Can't promise a date for the formal ceremony. These things take the time they take. But Diane, the recommendation is real. Approved at every level that matters. Nothing left in the process can undo that now. Then why does it still feel unfinished? I asked. More honestly than I meant to. Because the medal was never really the unfinished part, Webb said. The unfinished part was 11 letters sitting in your coat. A room full of people who deserved the truth. You've spent 2 months finishing that yourself, one kitchen table at a time. The medal's just paperwork catching up to a debt you already paid. I sat with that a long while, turned it over the way I used to turn over a diagnosis before committing to treatment, testing it for weakness, finding none. 2 days before the gala, I drove out to the small cemetery on the edge of town, where Ellis Calloway was buried, not far from where 3 other men from Iron Troop also rested. Their families had chosen, over the years, to bring them home to the same quiet hillside rather than scatter them across separate towns. I hadn't visited in over a year, stood at Ellis's headstone a long while, reading his dates, doing the math I always did without meaning to. 19 years old when he died. 19 forever now. While I went on aging into a life he never got the chance to have. I brought your mother the letter, I told the headstone. Quiet. The way you talk to the dead when nobody's around to think it's strange. She's angry it took so long. She has every right to be. But she has it now. Knows you asked about her softball game. Knows you weren't scared. The wind moved through the grass. Ordinary, indifferent. The way weather always is, regardless of what a person standing in a cemetery needs it to mean. There's a woman, I continued, who told your mother for years there wasn't time for any of you to say goodbye. I'm going to stand up Saturday and make sure that lie doesn't survive the night. I don't know if that's revenge or just correction. I think Daniel would say it doesn't matter what we call it, as long as it's true. I stood there until the light went gold and long across the hillside. Drove home. Laid out my one good navy dress across my bed. Sat with it a long time before finally letting myself, first time in longer than I could remember, sleep a full dreamless night. The morning of the gala, Cody Ellis showed up unannounced at my door, still in his oversized army windbreaker, looking nervous in a way that reminded me sharply of every young soldier I'd steadied before their first real test. My aunt told me what's happening tonight, he said. Said you're the medic, the one from my uncle's unit. I am, I said. I wanted to say thank you, he said before whatever happens tonight happens, for catching me that day outside the chapel. And for whatever you're about to do for my family, you don't need to thank me for either, I said. The first one was just training. The second one is just overdue. He hesitated at my door a moment longer, young and unsure, in a way that made him look, just for a second, almost exactly like the photographs of Miguel Petrosky at 19. The ones I still carried in memory more clearly than most of my own recent years. Will you tell me about him sometime? Cody asked. My Uncle Ellis, not the version from the fund's newsletters. The real one. Yes, I said, meant it completely. After tonight, I'll tell you everything I remember. All of it. He nodded, satisfied, and left. I stood in my doorway a long moment after, feeling something settle into place. It had been unsettled since the exact moment, 15 years earlier, a helicopter lifted me out of that valley, left 11 names behind, names I'd spend the rest of my life learning how to carry properly. Ruth picked me up that evening instead of meeting at the lodge, an arrangement I hadn't asked for, but was grateful for anyway. The particular comfort of not driving toward something so large alone. You look like a woman about to walk into a briefing, Ruth said. She studied me from the passenger seat as we pulled out of my driveway. That's about right, I said. The drive to the Elks Lodge took 11 minutes. Same 11 minutes it always took to reach the chapel on Marietta Road. I watched Chillicothe slide past the window, the paper mill's single shift, lit against the dusk. The Kroger where I'd found Sharon 2 months earlier. The library where I first typed Heather Coyle's name into a search bar and felt the floor of my quiet life tilt. I keep thinking about something Walter told me, I said, mostly to myself. Before he died, said people who carry things as quiet as I do don't stay quiet forever. They just wait for the right room. Do you think this is the right room? Ruth asked. I think it's the only room that ever mattered, I said. 15 years of rooms. This is the one waiting at the end of them. Ruth reached over, without looking away from the road, and squeezed my hand once. Hard. The grip of someone who's decided to be steady for you because she knows you're spending all your own steadiness on something bigger. "Whatever happens in there tonight," she said, "you already did the hardest part. 11 kitchen tables, 11 letters. That was the real work. Tonight's just the room finding out about it." I thought about that the rest of the drive, turned it over, slow, tested it the way I test every hard truth before I let myself believe it. She was right. The way people who've grieved longest are often right about grief's actual architecture. The letters had been the mission. Tonight was only the after-action report. We pulled into the Elks Lodge lot behind a line of cars stretching further than I remembered from any previous year. The fund's fundraising machine still running full strength, even with an Attorney General's review letter, presumably sitting somewhere on Heather Coyle's desk. I saw her car near the front. A clean silver sedan, Valley Angel's magnet on the door. I felt, just for a moment, something that surprised me by how uncomplicated it was. Not hatred, not even satisfaction. Something closer to the weary patience of a medic who's finally located the wound after searching too long, knows exactly what has to happen next. Colonel Webb's staff car pulled in a few spaces down as we parked. He stepped out in full dress uniform, tall, composed, his expression giving away nothing. "Sergeant Mercer," he said, walking over, using the rank the way he always did when the moment called for its full weight. "Are you ready?" "I don't know if ready is the right word," I said. "I know I'm not walking out of that room without doing what I came to do. Whether that's the same thing as ready, I couldn't tell you." That's the most honest answer I've ever gotten from a soldier before a mission, Webb said, something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth. It's also usually the truest sign someone's fully prepared. He offered his arm, old-fashioned, formal, exactly right for the formality of what we were about to do. I took it. Ruth fell into step on my other side, cane steady against the asphalt. Together, the three of us walked toward the lit windows of the Elks Lodge, toward a hall full of people who believed one story, about to learn another. "One more thing," Webb said quietly, just before we reached the door. "I called ahead this afternoon. The Gazette reporter who usually covers this event will be here. I confirmed with the county clerk's office that the Attorney General's review of the fund's filings opened this morning. Whatever happens inside tonight, it will not simply disappear once we walk back out." "Good," I said, found to my own quiet surprise that I meant it without a trace of doubt. It shouldn't disappear, not this time. We stepped through the doors together, into warmth and lily-scented air, the low murmur of 120 conversations. Somewhere near the front of that crowded hall, Heather Coyle was already moving toward the podium. Under stage lights she'd stood beneath for 5 straight years, about to begin a program she had no idea was about to become someone else's entirely. One more evening before the gala changed how I understood everything that came after. It happened on a Sunday, 4 days before the doors of the Elks Lodge opened for the last time under Heather Coyle's name. Sharon Petrosky invited me to her house for dinner. An ordinary thing. Meatloaf and green beans. The kind of meal that has nothing to do with valleys or medals or 15 years of silence. Her daughter was there too. Miguel's little sister. The one who'd made varsity softball. The one his letter had asked about with his second-to-last breath. Her name was Angela. 31 now. Married. 2 kids of her own. She still coached middle school softball, keeping a promise to her brother's memory she never quite knew she'd made. "Mom told me what you did," Angela said, setting a bowl of green beans on the table. "Driving to Portsmouth, Cincinnati, all those kitchens." "It wasn't hard," I said, "not compared to the 15 years I spent not doing it." Angela studied me a moment, the way people do when deciding whether to say something honest. "I used to be angry at you," she said. Before Mom explained, I thought, If this woman was really there, why did it take this long? Why didn't she come to us the first year? That's a fair question, I said. I don't have a good answer. I have a true one. I was scared. Grief made me a coward for 15 years. I told myself it was discipline instead. That's honest, Angela said. It's the only kind of honest that matters now, I said. Sharon put her hand on her daughter's arm. She's here now, Sharon said. That's what I keep telling myself too. Late isn't the same as never. We ate dinner slow that night, the four of us. Sharon, Angela, and Angela's husband, a quiet man named Peter who mostly listened. Somewhere between the meatloaf and the pie, I told them a story about Miguel. I hadn't told anyone yet, not even his mother. The last afternoon, I said, before things got bad, Miguel found a stray dog near our position. Skinny thing, mostly rib and dust. He gave it half his rations without telling anyone. Didn't want the other men to think he'd gone soft. Angela's eyes filled. That sounds exactly like him. He always brought home strays when we were kids. Mom used to say our yard was a shelter with extra steps. He asked me not to tell the captain, I said. Said Royce would have made him share the rest of the unit's food too. Said he only had enough sympathy that week for one dog. The whole table laughed. The good kind. The kind that comes after grief has sat heavy so long, a small joke feels like water breaking a fever. I think that's the part I needed, Sharon said later, walking me to my car. Not just the letter, the small things, the dog, the jokes. I spent 15 years with only the ending. You gave me back the middle of him too. I drove home that night thinking about the difference between an ending and a middle. Heather Coyle had only ever offered people endings. Tragic, tidy, useful for a donation pitch. The actual truth was always messier, smaller, far more alive than any story built for a podium could hold. 2 days later, Ruth called with one final piece of information. It hardened my resolve past any doubt that remained. I found something else, she said. Going through the fund's old newsletters, there was a family 5 years back, the Delacroix family, from a town over in Pike County. They pulled their support from the fund publicly, wrote a letter to the editor, said the fund had misrepresented what happened to their son. What happened to their letter? It ran once, Ruth said, in a local paper that folded 18 months later. I don't think Heather ever answered it publicly. I think she just outlasted it. I thought about that family, waiting years for someone to believe them, watching a folded newspaper carry their complaint into obscurity, while Heather Coyle's story kept growing louder every June. We need to find them, I said, before the gala, if we can. We found them 2 days before, an aging couple named Robert and Denise Delacroix, living quietly outside Waverly. They'd lost their son Gabriel in that valley, too. When I told them who I was, Denise sat down hard in her kitchen chair, both hands over her mouth. 15 years, she said. We've been telling people the truth and nobody believed us. We finally stopped trying. You were right the whole time, I told her. I'm sorry it took this long for someone to prove it. Robert looked at me a long moment, eyes sharp despite his age. Will you be there Saturday? At the gala? I will, I said. So will the truth. I intend to make sure of it. Ben will be there too, he said. 15 years is long enough, waiting in the back row of our own grief. I left their house that afternoon with one more name added to the list, one more chair that would be filled Saturday night by someone who'd waited far too long to be believed. Driving home in the fading light, I understood something plainly. This had never really been about Heather Coyle at all. It had always been about every family in that room, finally getting to sit up front. Inside, the Elks Lodge Hall had been transformed the way it was every June. Round tables draped in white cloth, centerpieces of white lilies, A slideshow of the 11 men's faces looping silently on a screen behind a small stage. Around 120 people filled the room. Families, local business owners who sponsored tables, a reporter from the Chillicothe Gazette with a notepad, a photographer from the local news affiliate setting up a tripod near the back. Heather Coyle moved through the crowd in a pale blue dress, her angel wing pin catching the light, greeting donors with both hands wrapped around theirs, voice pitched low and warm, performing intimacy the way she always did, like grief was a stage she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. I found Sharon Petrosky near the front, sitting with 3 other families Ruth had reached out to that week. Women and men I now recognized by the shape of their loss rather than their faces. The particular stillness of people who'd spent 15 years believing a version of events that was never quite true. "You look different tonight," Sharon said, studying me. "I feel different," I said, and sat down beside her. Colonel Webb arrived a few minutes later, in his dress uniform, ribbons and stars catching the low light. The shift in the room was immediate, total. Conversations paused, heads turned. A 4-star general doesn't walk into a small-town Elks Lodge without every person in that room understanding, instantly, that something significant is about to happen. Heather saw him too. I watched her face from across the room, watched the practiced warmth flicker, just for a half second, into something colder, more calculating, before she smoothed it back into place. She crossed the room to greet him personally, both hands extended, the way she did with every donor. "General," she said, "what an incredible honor. I had no idea we'd have such distinguished company tonight." "Colonel," he corrected, mild, unbothered. "And I'm here for the families, all of them." Something in the way he said, all of them, made her smile falter, just for a moment before she recovered. "Of course," she said. "Please, sit anywhere you like. We'll be starting the program shortly." I watched her walk away, back toward the small stage, back toward the podium where she'd stood every year, telling a story that belonged to someone else. I felt Sharon's hand find mine under the table, gripping tight. "Is this it?" Sharon whispered. "Is tonight the night?" "I think so," I said. "I don't know exactly how it happens, but I think tonight it happens." The program began the way it always did. A local pastor offered an opening prayer. A representative from the county commissioner's office read a proclamation honoring the 15th anniversary of the Valley. The slideshow ran again, 11 faces cycling slow and silent. I watched Ellis Calloway's crooked grin pass across the screen and felt Ruth's hand find my shoulder from the row behind me. Then Heather Coyle stepped up to the podium. She looked radiant under the stage lights, pale blue dress catching the glow just right, her expression arranged into exactly the right measure of solemn and warm. A woman who'd clearly done this many times, who knew precisely how to hold a room. 15 years ago, she began, voice trembling on cue. 11 of Ross County's finest sons went into a valley in Afghanistan. I had the privilege of being with some of them in their final hours. I felt the room's attention settle on her the way it always did. That particular hush a good performer knows how to summon. I held their hands, she continued. I told them they were loved, and in the years since, I've dedicated my life to making sure their sacrifice is never forgotten, that their families are cared for, that the Valley Angels Memorial Fund stands as a living tribute to men who... She stopped. She stopped because Colonel Marcus Webb had risen from his seat in the second row. Slow, deliberate, the unhurried motion of a man who's commanded rooms for 30 years. Who knows, stillness carries more authority than speed ever could. The room's attention swung from Heather to him in a single collective breath. "Forgive the interruption," Webb said. His voice carried easily to every corner of the hall without needing amplification. But I served with those 11 men. I commanded the brigade iron troop belonged to, and I was Captain Daniel Royce's commanding officer, the man who wrote the after-action report on that valley, whose recommendation letters I still carry with me 15 years later. Heather's hand had gone very still on the podium. "I'm sorry, General," she said. "Colonel, but this is a scheduled program, and if you'd like to share remarks, I'm happy to." "There was only one medic in that column," Webb said, cutting through her gently but completely, the way a surgeon cuts, precise, without malice, without hesitation. One person who moved between wounded men for over 3 hours, under fire. One person who kept 8 of those 11 alive as long as humanly possible, who held the hands of the other 3 as they passed. Who has carried their final letters home in her coat for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to deliver them, because that is the kind of soldier she has always been. Quiet, exact, never once asking for a single thing in return. The room had gone completely, absolutely silent. Every eye in the hall shifted toward me before I'd even fully understood that Webb meant me. I felt Sharon's hand tighten around mine, felt Ruth's fingers dig into my shoulder from behind. I sat very still, the way I'd trained myself to sit still through 15 years of moments that mattered too much to move through carelessly. Heather Coyle's face had gone the color of chalk. "That woman," Webb continued, and I felt the weight of 120 pairs of eyes turn as one, "is Sergeant Diane Mercer. She was the medic for Iron Troop 2nd Squadron. And tonight, I am not here to give a speech. I am here to correct a record that has been wrong for far too long." He reached into his uniform jacket, withdrew a single folded page, worn soft at its creases. I recognized it instantly. The twin of the copy sitting in my own coat pocket at that exact moment. 15 years ago, Webb said, unfolding the page with careful hands, Captain Daniel Royce wrote this recommendation. Before he died of the wounds he took in that same valley, wounds Sergeant Mercer treated with her own hands, until his heart finally stopped beating under hers. He looked up once, directly at me. Something passed between us that felt like both an apology and a promise. "I am going to read one line of it," he said, turning back to the room. "Just one, because one line is all the truth has ever needed." The room held its breath. I felt my own pulse in my throat, steady, the way it always was, even now, even here. I thought of Daniel Royce's handwriting on the front of that envelope, his voice in my memory saying, "Make it mean something." I understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grace, that this was the moment it finally would. Webb's eyes moved down the page. His voice, when it came, was low and even. It carried to every corner of that silent hall. Sergeant Mercer held each of the final 3 men as they died, in the open, under continued fire, refusing to withdraw to cover until every wounded soldier in that column had been treated or accounted for. He let the words sit in the room a moment, the way you let a vital sign settle before you read it twice to be sure. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed loud enough to be heard. "That," Webb said, folding the page closed again, "is the truth of what happened in that valley 15 years ago. Not a story told from a podium by someone who was never there. The truth, in the handwriting of a dying captain, about the medic who held 11 men through the worst hours of their lives, who then carried their unspoken last words home in her own coat for 15 years, because she could not find a way to hand a mother her son's goodbye without breaking both their hearts open again." I stood up. I don't know exactly when I decided to stand, only that my body did it before my mind had caught up. the same way it used to move toward wounded men before fear got a chance to argue me out of it. Every face in that hall turned toward me at once. I looked at Sharon Petrosky. Her hand had slipped from mine when I rose. Her eyes were wet, her mouth slightly open. I looked at Ruth Calloway, standing now too, cane forgotten at her side, one hand pressed flat against her chest. I looked at the other families Ruth had gathered, faces I'd only recently learned to read, faces finally hearing, after 15 years, something closer to the whole truth. And I looked, last, at Heather Coyle, still standing behind the podium, her pale blue dress suddenly looking less like a costume of grief, more like exactly what it was, a costume. Her face collapsing in slow motion from performance into something raw and undefended and afraid. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, carrying clean through the silent hall the way Webb's had. "I'm here because 11 men trusted me with their last words, and I let fear keep those words locked in my coat far too long. That's my failure, not anyone else's. I've spent the last 2 months trying to correct it, one family at a time." I reached into my own coat, drew out the folded photocopies I'd carried with me. Not the original letters, those had already found their way home, but copies of what mattered most. I held them up, not as a weapon, just as proof. "Every family in this room who lost a son in that valley has now received his letter," I said. "His actual last words, written in his own hand. I should have delivered them 15 years ago. I'm sorry it took me this long to find the courage." Ruth's voice rose from behind me, clear and strong despite the tremor in it. "She's telling the truth. My son's letter mentioned his sister's softball game. Nobody but someone who was actually there could have known that." Sharon stood too, her voice breaking but determined. "Mine asked me never to let his sister quit softball. She coaches now, 6 years. Nobody told this woman that. She told me." One by one, around the hall, the other families Ruth had reached began to rise, each with some small, specific detail their letter had contained. Details no fabricated grief could have invented. Details only someone who'd truly been there, truly held those hands, truly heard those last unfinished sentences, could possibly have carried home. Heather Coyle stood frozen behind the podium, her hands gripping its edges so hard her knuckles had gone white. I watched the story she'd built over 5 years come apart in real time, not through anger, not through accusation, just through the plain, unglamorous weight of the truth, finally spoken by the people who actually held it. "I never claimed," she started, but her voice cracked and gave out. She didn't finish the sentence. There wasn't a version of it that could survive the room she was standing in. Colonel Webb turned toward her, his expression not cruel, not triumphant, simply final, the expression of a man closing a file that should have been closed years earlier. "Ms. Coyle," he said, "I understand the Ohio Attorney General's Charitable Law Section has opened a review of this fund's financial records. I would encourage you to cooperate fully. These families deserve a full accounting of every dollar given in their sons' names." A murmur moved through the hall at that, low, rippling. The sound of 120 people realizing something at once. The story of the evening had just widened far beyond a single podium. Heather looked out at the room, at the families standing, at the reporter from the Gazette scribbling fast, at the photographer's camera clicking steadily now. Something in her seemed to simply give way. The posture, the practiced warmth, all of it collapsing at once, like a structure that never had real footings underneath it. She stepped back from the podium without another word, walked quickly toward the side exit, heels loud on the hardwood floor in the otherwise silent hall. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody needed to. The truth had already done everything that needed doing. I stood in the middle of that hall, surrounded by families finally holding the whole shape of their own grief. Instead of a borrowed piece of someone else's, I felt Colonel Webb's hand settle on my shoulder. Steady, warm, the way a superior officer's hand settles when a mission has finally, after far too long, reached its conclusion. "There's one more thing," he said. "Quiet now, just for me. I told you I wasn't here to give a speech tonight." I lied a little. "There's one more piece of paper I need to read, and I need you standing right here, in front of everyone, when I read it." I felt my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief. "Colonel Sergeant Mercer," Webb said, raising his voice again, addressing the room. Something in the shift of his tone made the entire hall go still once more. The families slowly lowered back into their seats. Every eye returned to the small stage, to the two of us standing in front of it. 15 years ago, Captain Daniel Royce recommended you for the Medal of Honor. That recommendation was lost, through no fault of yours, lost in the chaos of a system that fails too many quiet, exceptional soldiers, the ones who never ask for recognition. I have spent the last 2 months personally ensuring that failure is corrected." He reached again into his jacket. This time, he withdrew a second document. Official, embossed, unmistakably different from the worn, handwritten page he'd read from moments before. "This morning," Webb said, voice carrying clear and proud through the hall, "I received formal confirmation. The review board has approved the recommendation. The paperwork for your Medal of Honor is now, after 15 years, moving through final processing for presidential approval." The hall erupted, not loud, not chaotic, but a rising, unified sound. Chairs scraping back, 120 people rising to their feet at once, applause breaking out low, then swelling. I stood in the middle of it, hands pressed flat against my chest, unable, for the first time in 15 years, to find a single steady word to say. I looked for Sharon Petrosky first, found her crying openly, clapping, mouthing something that might have been "thank you." I looked for Ruth Calloway, standing tall despite her cane, forgotten on the floor beside her chair, both hands pressed to her mouth. I looked, last, toward the doorway where Heather Coyle had disappeared, found it empty, the door still swinging faintly on its hinge, the last physical trace of a story that had finally, completely, run out of room to hide in. Colonel Webb turned to me, his own eyes bright, in a way I'd never once seen from him in all the years I'd known him. "Sergeant Mercer," he said, on behalf of a captain who never stopped believing this day would come, "it is the honor of my career to be the one standing beside you when it finally did." I didn't say anything. I don't get loud. I get steady. But standing in that hall, surrounded by 120 people on their feet, I let myself feel it, for the first time in 15 years, the full weight of being seen, without flinching away from it. The applause took a long time to settle, longer than any ovation I'd ever stood inside of. When it finally quieted, the hall didn't return to its earlier hush. It shifted into a new kind of stillness, the stillness of a room that just watched the ground move under a story it believed was solid. The post commander made his way to the small stage once the applause settled. A heavy-set man named Frank Delgado, who'd run the lodge's veteran outreach over a decade, his own face still faintly stunned. "On behalf of this post," he said into the microphone, voice a little unsteady, "I want to say first, congratulations to Sergeant Mercer on a recognition 15 years overdue and entirely earned." Another ripple of applause moved through the room, warmer now, less shocked, more simply grateful. "Second," Delgado continued, tone growing heavier, effective immediately, This post is freezing its association with the Valley Angels Memorial Fund, pending the outcome of the state's review. Any donations collected here tonight will instead be held in an escrow account, managed directly by the Post, until a proper accounting can be made. The funds will go directly to the families they were always meant to serve. The room broke into fresh murmurs, this one edged with something closer to anger than shock. The anger of generous people realizing exactly how their generosity had been managed. I found Sharon's eyes across the room. She gave me a small, exhausted nod, the nod of someone who'd spent 15 years absorbing one grief and had just, in 20 minutes, been asked to absorb an entirely different one. The grief of being quietly deceived by someone she'd trusted. Ruth leaned close as the room began to stir with the restless energy of people who wanted to talk, to ask questions, to understand more fully what they'd just witnessed. "It's not over," she said. "Quiet. Just for me. Is it?" "No," I said. "This is just the part where it becomes real to everyone else. The actual unwinding will take longer. Audits always do." I found Robert and Denise Delacroix near the back of the hall, still seated, still holding hands, the way they'd held them the whole evening. Denise caught my eye and mouthed two words. "Thank you." I made my way over once the crowd thinned enough to move. 15 years, Denise said, standing to meet me. 15 years, and tonight a room full of strangers finally believed us in under a minute. "You believed yourselves the whole time," I said. "That's the part that matters." The room just finally caught up. Robert shook my hand, his grip firm despite his age. "Gabriel would have liked you," he said. "He didn't suffer fools. Neither do you, from what I've seen tonight." "High praise," I said, and meant it. It did take longer, though not nearly as long as I'd feared. Within a week, the Ohio Attorney General's charitable law section confirmed publicly that its review had escalated from a general inquiry into a formal investigation. Following the Post's own financial disclosure and several additional complaints filed by families in the days after the gala, Patricia Sowers called to tell me the fund's charitable registration renewal, the one Ruth had first mentioned weeks earlier, had been denied, pending the outcome of the investigation, effectively freezing the fund's ability to solicit any further donations under its existing structure. "She can't collect another dollar," Patricia told me, "until this is resolved. And given what the auditors are already finding, I don't expect that resolution to go well for her." It didn't. 3 weeks after the gala, the Gazette ran a front-page story. Careful and factual. $211,000 raised over 5 years. Only around 4,300 distributed directly to families. The remainder traced through bank records to Heather Coyle's personal accounts, her car payment, her mortgage, a series of vacations documented in her own since-deleted social media posts. The Ohio Board of Nursing opened its own inquiry not long after, following a complaint from 3 of the families, questioning whether Heather's public claims that she'd provided end-of-life comfort to men she'd never actually treated violated the ethical standards of her nursing license. I didn't celebrate any of it. It would be easy to say I felt a clean satisfaction, watching her fund collapse, her name in a headline instead of a gala program. I didn't. Daniel Royce never built me to feel satisfaction in another person's ruin, only in the truth finally standing where it belonged. What I felt mostly in the weeks after the gala was tired in a way that felt earned rather than heavy. The specific tiredness that comes after a mission finally, completely concludes. Colonel Webb called every week or two with updates on the medal's progress through the Pentagon's final channels. Careful, unhurried, methodical progress, matching, almost eerily, the pace of my own quiet campaign months earlier. There will eventually be a ceremony, he told me one evening in July. The president's schedule and the process being what they are, I can't tell you exactly when. But Diane, I want you to understand something. Whenever it happens, wherever it happens, it will happen. Daniel's recommendation is finally, permanently, part of the official record. Nothing can lose it again. Thank you, I said, meant it in a way words rarely fully carry. Don't thank me, Webb said. Thank the man who wrote it, and thank yourself for finally trusting a room enough to let it hear the whole truth. Cody Ellis kept his promise to visit more regularly than I expected. I kept mine in return. Over several long evenings on my small back porch, I told him everything I remembered about his Uncle Ellis. The way he laughed too loud at his own jokes, the way he carried a photograph of his little sister in his left breast pocket, the way he asked, in his last clear minutes, whether she'd made the softball team. Twice. Like the question mattered more than his own survival. He sounds like he would have liked me, Cody said one evening, half joking, half hopeful. The way young men are when they measure themselves against a relative they never got to meet. He would have loved you, I told him. He talked about family the way some people talk about scripture, constant, certain, the only fixed point in a world that kept moving under him. Ruth and I grew closer that summer than either of us expected. Two women who'd spent 15 years carrying the same grief from opposite directions, finally meeting somewhere in the middle of it. She started coming to the hospice house some evenings, sitting with me during quiet shifts, keeping company with patients who had nobody else. The two of us discovering, almost by accident, a second calling neither of us had gone looking for. I used to think grief was something you got through, she told me one night. We sat beside a sleeping patient's bed, the hallway lights dimmed low around us. I don't think that anymore. I think it's something you eventually learn to carry differently. Lighter, maybe, but never gone. I think that's right, I said. I carried mine wrong for 15 years, still learning what carrying it right even looks like. You delivered 11 letters, Ruth said. I'd say you're further along than you're giving yourself credit for. By August, the investigation into Valley Angels Memorial Fund had concluded its preliminary phase. The Attorney General's office announced Heather Coyle would face formal charges related to charitable fraud and misappropriation of donated funds, alongside the separate nursing board proceeding that could permanently revoke her license. I read the announcement in the Gazette on a quiet Tuesday morning, coffee going cold beside me at my kitchen table. I felt, mostly, a kind of settled finality. The calm that comes after a wound has finally been properly cleaned and dressed, instead of simply covered over and left to fester. I thought about Daniel Royce's handwriting on that envelope, about make it mean something. I understood fully now that it had never meant destroying anyone. It had meant refusing to let a lie stand simply because the truth was harder to carry. It had meant 11 letters delivered, one kitchen table at a time. It had meant a room full of people finally hearing what actually happened in a valley most of them would never see, told by the one person who'd truly been there the whole time. In September, I finally allowed myself to do the one thing I'd put off since the gala. Longer than that, really. Since the morning 15 years ago, when a helicopter first lifted me out of that valley and left 11 names for me to carry alone. I drove to the two remaining families I'd only reached by phone. The Vargas family, whose son Isaac had died fourth in that terrible sequence, and the Kimballs, 2 towns over. Their son Peter had lingered longest of any of them, nearly 40 minutes before he finally let go. I sat with the Vargas family at their kitchen table, told them how Isaac had spent his last clear minutes not afraid, but focused entirely on making sure I told his mother he loved her. In exactly those words, no embellishment. The plain truth of a boy who'd run out of time to say anything more complicated. He always was direct like that, his mother said, laughing through her tears. Never one for fancy words. I'm glad that didn't change. Even at the end, the Kimballs asked me the hardest question I'd faced in the entire 2-month campaign, whether their son had been scared. I thought carefully before I answered, the way I always tried to, with a question that already carried more weight than any grief should have to hold. He was steady, I said. Steadier than most grown men I've treated since. He asked me to make sure you knew he wasn't sorry he went. Said it was the first time in his whole life he'd been certain he was doing something that mattered. Mr. Kimball, a quiet man who'd said almost nothing through the whole visit, finally spoke, his voice thick. That sounds exactly like him. Certain. Stubborn about it, too. I visited the Delacroix family again that same week, out past Waverly. Not to deliver a letter this time. Gabriel's had already reached them years before, through channels that never once credited the right person. I went to sit with them instead, to finally set the record straight about how his last hours had actually gone. Denise cried harder that visit than she had at the gala, the relief of grief finally matching the truth, instead of a stranger's borrowed version of it. We always knew, Robert said, walking me to my car. We just didn't know anyone would ever say it out loud where it counted. It counted tonight, I said. It'll keep counting. That kind of truth doesn't wear out. Denise walked me to the porch steps and pressed something small into my hand before I left. A pressed flower, dried flat inside a square of wax paper, the kind children make in grade school and parents keep for decades after. Gabriel picked this the summer before he shipped out, she said. Seemed right, you should have something too. Not just us. I kept it in my coat after that, next to where the envelope used to sit. A small weight where an old one used to be, light enough now that I barely noticed it was there at all. By the time I finished visiting every family, all 11, I'd delivered every letter Daniel Royce trusted me to carry. 15 years and 4 months after I first promised him I would. The taped envelope itself, the original, empty now of everything it once held, I brought back to Chillicothe. Set it on my kitchen table one final evening. Looked at it a long while. The way you look at an old wound, finally, fully healed. I thought about throwing it away. Seemed, for a moment, like the natural conclusion. A debt paid. An object no longer needed. Instead, I drove out to the small cemetery on the edge of town one last time, to the quiet hillside where Ellis Calloway and 3 of the others rested. I found the newest addition among the graves I'd come to know. A plain military headstone, placed only that summer, at Colonel Webb's insistence and with the Army's eventual cooperation, marking the symbolic resting place of Captain Daniel Royce. His body had been returned home to his own family in Virginia 15 years earlier. But Webb felt strongly his name deserved a marker here, too, among the men he died trying to save. I knelt at the headstone, set the empty envelope down against its base, weighted it with a small stone from the hillside so the wind wouldn't carry it off. I finished it, I told him, quiet. The way I always talked to the dead when nobody else was around to think it strange. All 11. Every one of them knows now. Every one of them has your words instead of just your absence. The wind moved through the grass. Same as always, indifferent, ordinary. I found, kneeling there, that I didn't need it to mean anything more than that. Carrying them was the easy part, I said, standing slowly, my old leg aching the way it always did in the cool of early autumn. Setting them down where they belonged was the duty. I drove home in the last gold light of the afternoon, past the paper mill running its single shift, past the Kroger on Bridge Street, past the library where I'd first typed a stranger's name into a search bar, started down a road I couldn't have predicted the end of. The medal ceremony came the following spring, nearly a year after that night at the Elks Lodge, held not in Chillicothe, but in Washington, a room far grander than any I'd ever expected to stand in. Ruth Calloway and Sharon Petrosky and Cody Ellis sat in the audience, alongside Colonel Webb, who had, by then, become something closer to family than commanding officer. I won't describe the ceremony in great detail. Some rooms are meant to be lived rather than narrated. That one belonged more to Daniel Royce's memory than to any account I could give of it. I'll tell you only this. When the citation was finally read aloud in full, in a Washington hall instead of a Chillicothe gala, I stood steady. As steady as I'd stood in every hard room of my life. Somewhere in the middle of it, I felt something in my chest finally, completely, unclench. 15 years of held breath, releasing all at once into a room built to hold exactly that kind of weight. Heather Coyle's case moved through the courts that same spring, ending in a plea agreement, restitution to the families, a permanent revocation of her nursing license. I didn't attend the hearing, had no need to see her face again, to know the truth had already done everything I needed it to do. Ruth told me later Heather had left Chillicothe entirely after sentencing, moved somewhere none of us ever asked about. When Ruth told me, I felt nothing sharper than a kind of tired relief. The relief of a wound finally closed, rather than a war finally won. I still work nights at the hospice house on Western Avenue, still hold hands there mostly. A different kind of dying, the same kind of holding. Ruth still comes some evenings, and the two of us have started quietly organizing a small fund of our own. Nothing grand, no gala, no coffee can, just a modest account managed by 3 signatures instead of 1, distributing what little we raise directly and immediately to the families of Ross County veterans who need it. No overhead, no podium, no story told from a stage. Cody Ellis finished his enlistment last winter, came home to Chillicothe for good. Some evenings he sits with me on my back porch and asks about his uncle, and I tell him. Some evenings he just sits, quiet, the way soldiers sometimes need to sit, and I let him. I remember, better than almost anyone, exactly how much that kind of quiet can carry. I don't get loud, I get steady. I said that to myself the first morning a nurse in teal scrubs told me I didn't belong. In a chapel full of men I'd carried out of a valley with my own 2 hands. I still say it to myself some mornings now, though it means something different than it used to. It used to mean survival, the bare minimum discipline required to keep moving through a grief too large to feel all at once. Now it means something closer to peace, the quiet, ordinary kind nobody writes citations for. I stopped carrying it alone. I set the bag down. Some evenings now I still sit quiet on that back porch with Cody. Porch light on, 2 chairs, 1 empty coffee cup between us. The quiet, just quiet.